start. I want to go over this morning some things that will be repetitive in some ways, some biblical historical lessons for today. I'm going to hit the same thing 6 different ways, 6 different Bible verses, because I think this is where God has us today. So the first one I want to hit comes out of Job 12:7. In Job 12:7, the scripture says, "Ask the animals and they will teach you." Now, this is one of the greatest teaching ways of learning what God has is animals. I can take you to our ranch and show you from what the ants do exactly how the federal budget is to work. And I don't say that facetiously. That is what he's put in there. If you doubt that, read Proverbs 6, because Proverbs 6 talks about the ants. You see them out there. I can give you so many lessons from nature. It's so substantial that in Romans 1:20, God says everything that can be known about God, including the intricacies of the Godhead, have been revealed through what he has created. If you study nature, you even get theology down. So that's why the Bible says, ask the animals, they will teach you. So in doing that, I want to start with the lion. I want to emphasize the lion in the first part of what we're going to cover today. The lion, when you look at the lion, every lion in a pride has a role. The pride is the family or the group, and they all have a specific role. They are the king of the beast. There's nothing top of the food chain above them. And so when you listen to a lion or watch a lion roar, it's interesting that everything runs away from them because they are the king of beasts. They are the top, again, of that food chain. Now, they live on a savanna, and it's interesting that when a lion roars, and it's the male lion that roars. It's not the female lions that roar. It's a male lion that roars. When he roars on that savanna, he can be heard up to 5 miles away. Now, maybe you've yelled at your kids before. I guarantee you nobody heard you 5 miles away. So when this lion roars, he can be heard for up to 5 miles. At the time that he roars, he sends everything scurrying. They have a tendency to run. Now, what happens is when you look at that savanna and you see all these animals all over, there's just animals all over that savanna. What happens is the way that they work in that pride, that lion pride, is the male lion will get at one end of the savanna, and the female lions will get at the other end of the savanna. Now, this is substantial because the male is loud. He's the one everybody's scared of. He makes all the noise, but he's not the dangerous one. Now, he is dangerous, but it's the female lions that do all the killing. They find all the food for the family, all the food for the prey. They don't make any noise, but they're the ones that are the most dangerous. So out of this group of lions, they're the ones you got to watch out for, but he's the one that makes all the noise. And so what happens is when that lion roars, when everything gets set up, he will be at the end and he will roar. And when he roars, all the animals start moving. What do? They run away from the roar. They run away from the noise he's making. And in doing that, they run right into the waiting arms of the female lions. So they get themselves killed by running away from what scares them the most. It's what they don't see that they should be scared of. What you see is not necessarily what you need to be scared of. So what you find is that if you want a safe place with a lion, you have to learn to run to the roar. So when you hear something that's really scary, really fearful, you don't turn and run away from it. Now, it's not that he's not dangerous. He is. But of all the things out there, he's the least dangerous of what's there. And so it's counterintuitive for us to run to the roar, but that's exactly what you learn from the animals, is if those gazelles and those zebras and everything else would run to the roar, they have a much better chance of getting by him because he's slow. Now, he's mean and tough if you get in his range, but if you go toward him, your best chance of getting by him is running right at him. So that's something that we want to emphasize. Satan is as a roaring lion. We shouldn't be running away from conflict, shouldn't be running away from the noise, shouldn't be running away from Satan. Boy, that's a stronghold. Great. That's great. I'm going to run right at it. So that's what I'm going to emphasize in 5 other ways. So running to the roar. The second is, let me take you back to this thing about running to the roar. Why is running to the roar a good idea? Well, among other things, other scriptures that tell us about lions is that the righteous are bold as a lion. So what are we doing running away from stuff? That shouldn't be our response. We should be the ones running to it. They should be running away from us because we should have the boldness. So we still think, see, this is a problem with thinking. If you look at the scriptures, there's a number of animals given, but we're told in John 10, Jesus says, I'm the shepherd, you're the sheep. Now, don't think that is a compliment, because it's not. It says a whole lot about the shepherd. Sheep are the dumbest animals in God's creation. It's not a good thing to be called a sheep, but it tells you a lot about the shepherd that could handle something that dumb. And I say that because we raise sheep. And even to this day, I have to use psychological warfare with the sheep They are the most rebellious, stubborn critter out there. If I want them to go out of the pen, I will try to keep them in the pen. That guarantees they will go out. Whatever I do, they will do the opposite of. So if you can be a shepherd, that says something about you. It doesn't say a whole lot about you to be a sheep. So having said that, what happens is, we're told in Proverbs 23:7 that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. We start thinking like a sheep, we'll start acting like a sheep. The righteous are bold as a lion. We need to think more like a lion than like a sheep. So again, what we have to do is, we shouldn't be the ones running away from stuff. We should be the ones that other people run away from us because of the boldness we have. So making this point a different way, take you to what the Scripture says about heaven and hell. We know that there are real places. We're told in John 14:6, nobody comes to heaven except through the Father. The only way to get to heaven is through Jesus Christ. We're also told a lot about hell. There's a lot of verses today. There's a lot of people who don't believe it's real. 72% of pastors in America today do not believe that hell is a real place. So polling is done, 384,000 pastors in America. George Barton polls about 500 today. Do you think do you think Satan is a real or an imaginary being on whom we blame things? And, oh, he's an imaginary being. There is no hell. So there is a hell, and we know that it exists because the Bible tells us in Revelation 21:8, it says there is a lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. The Bible says there's a hell. Who goes to hell? That's what the first part of the verse tells us. It says, those that are faithless and detestable, the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars. These are really bad dudes. Look what they've done. What they do is what puts them in hell. Except, you'll notice a gap up there. What's missing? The first thing on the list is the fearful and the cowards. It's what they didn't do. See, not having a backbone will send you to hell faster than being a murderer. I don't know faster, but it's at least at the top of the list. See, we don't think in that terms. We tend to back away from stuff. Being cowards, being fearful, those are the folks that lead the way into hell, and that's not a good position to be in. So again, this deals with mentality, the way we think. So running to the roar, this is the emphasis again. Let me make the point in a different way, get in a different mindset on this. I want to take you into the book of Job for a minute. Job is where we were told in Job 12:7, ask the animals and they will teach you. So in the book of Job, you have the first 37 chapters where Job gets whacked by God, and then for the next 37 chapters is theological controversy. Job says, this shouldn't have happened to me. I was righteous. His three friends said, no, God doesn't whack righteous people. He whacked you because you were wicked. If you would just repent. And so they go back and forth with theology for 37 chapters. Elihu shows up in the middle and jumps both of them and says, you're wrong for your self-righteousness. You're wrong for your self-pity. Nonetheless, God shows up in chapter 38. And when God shows up in chapter 38, all he does is ask a bunch of questions. And most of the questions he asks are about nature. It's interesting that when you get to Job chapter 39, verses 19 through 25, one of the animals he's talking about, he says, if you guys are so smart, if you know so much, tell me about the horse. He says, do you give the horse his strength or clothe its neck with a flowing mane? Do you make it leap like a locust, striking terror with its proud snorting? It paws fiercely, rejoicing in its strength, and charges into the fray. It laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It does not shy away from the sword. The quiver rattles against its side, along with a flashing spear and lance. In frenzied excitement, it eats up the ground. It cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. At the blast of the trumpet, it snorts, aha! It catches the scent of battle from afar, the sound of commanders and the battle cry. Now, nobody thinks about horses in the term that they thought about them back then because we're all mechanized now. But if you go back and look at all the early artwork, horses were a key part of battle. And you can go through the early civilizations, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Jews. You move on into the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians, and you move up through the Celts in the 1200s, and then you get into America. A war horse was a key part of what you did, a key part of strategy. Now, again, today they're more like pets than they are part of the war. But back then, they were a big part of war. And so it's interesting. Notice some of the phrases God said. Did you make the horse? Because here's the way I made it. In Job, again, the same passage says, it laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It does not shy away from the sword. This is the way I make things. And so God's saying, haven't you ever paid attention to this? He says, in frenzied excitement, it catches the scent of battle. Can't wait for another good fight. That's usually not our mindset. The mindset of what he created is it charges into battle, it looks for a good fight, says it cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. Hear the sound of a war, I gotta go over there. There's a battle going on, they need me over there. So that warrior kind of mentality is what Christianity is not displaying today. We're backing up from anybody that challenged us because in love we don't want to create controversy. No, it's not in love that you don't create controversy. What you do is you run to the battle and you stand up and win. And so we are going the wrong direction in the way that we look at this. So again, running to the war, another way of looking at this, making the point a different way. Let me take you to what's happening with social media. Since the election in November, there have been 70,000 individuals and groups that have been deplatformed. Now, you look at the messages of those groups, a lot of them include just prayer groups, groups that were praying for Israel, groups that are praying for revival, just gone. That's a message we don't want up. In the same way, we had all sorts of pro-family groups that were taken down. If you believe that marriage is between a man and a woman and you should have children, what we call the nuclear family, that'll get you gone real quick if you come out with that position. Same thing with life. There were 70 different pro-life groups taken down because they think you should protect life in an unborn state. The same thing with even constitutional conservative groups, what are called those conservative constitutionalists. They're down too because that's the wrong message. We don't want this on our platform. Now, it used to be that it was a platform, not a publisher. They're now publishers. This is the debate we're having in Congress over Section 230. Nonetheless, they are censoring speech that they disagree with. Now, when all that happens, what kind of message do we get out of that? Because particularly they don't care about the other side. You can be as violent and as rough as you want on the other side. You can be communist, you can be Antifa, you can be anarchist, you can be anything. We haven't seen any of those groups taken down. They're still there, but these other groups are down. So what is the message we get out of this? The message is if you want to reach your friends, you're going to have to tone down what you believe and say. Because now you've got 183 friends on Facebook and you reach them, but if you want to keep reaching them, don't talk about these issues right here. So what it is an intimidation to make a real clear shot across the bow. This is the philosophy we do not want you talking about on our platforms. So this, again, is that mentality of do we run into the battle, do we charge into the fray, let me double down rather than back off. Rather than becoming weaker, I'm going to go the opposite direction. So this is where Hebrews 10:38, God tells us, he says, I have no pleasure in those who shrink back. If you're going to get intimidated and back up, that's not going to make me a happy camper. So God's standpoint is being offensive-minded, not defensive-minded, not being the nice guy. Not that we're not nice guys. Don't misunderstand. I'm talking about the mentality. You can be a happy warrior, as Ronald Reagan used to say. You don't have to be an unhappy person to be offensive-minded. So that's... If you get wind of a battle, you run into it. You look for opportunities to get engaged. You don't let somebody else will fight that battle. Well, let somebody else take that to court on Section 230. No, you run toward the battle. When you get wind of a battle, like the battle horse, you run toward the battle. The final one I'll give you about running to the roar, same point, a different way. It deals with what is recently happening in schools. We were called by a legislator, actually emailed by a legislator who sent us, he said, here's the new standards for my state. Here's what they're doing in my state. And the new standards were of quite a bit of interest to us, the American history standards. In that state, what they did was they removed any mention of the American Revolution, any mention of the Civil War, any mention of World War I, any mention of World War II, any mention of the Holocaust. All of that was taken out. My gosh, if you take that out, what do you have left? What happens is what we're doing is we're taking out anything that deals with documentable historical fact. We're replacing it with political philosophy. It's not about facts because a whole lot of what is being advocated now by way of historical philosophy is absolutely historically incorrect. Easy to prove. That's why you got to get rid of history because that's an anchor of truth, and we're not into truth right now. We're into my side winning or we're into this philosophy moving forward. And so anything that stands in the way of truth. So when you look at this, think about education. Think about what's been happening here in Aledo for the last few months, the last few years for that matter. What we see now is education. Man, we think about trying to change the public school system. That is such a big battle. I mean, that literally is what we would call a stronghold. And this is a stronghold. But here's the thing about strongholds. Strongholds, they're big, they're intimidating. They go, oh my gosh, that's too big for me to attack. The strongholds, the Bible tells us that in Proverbs 21:22, a wise man attacks the city of the mighty and tears down the stronghold in which they trust. Oh, is that a stronghold? Great. That's an invitation for me to attack. See, our mentality is we predetermine whether we're going to win or not. We decide I can't beat that stronghold. There's no way I can change the Aledo school system. I'm just going to back. No. A wise man attacks the stronghold of the mighty, attacks the city of the mighty, tears down the stronghold in which they trust. So the idea of attacking the stronghold, this is the same theme again. We're seeing over and over in Scriptures being offensive-minded, going on the offensive, going on the attack. And so storming the castle is another way of saying it. If you remember the movie Princess Bride, have fun storming the castle. It's all being offensive-minded. And that's what we have to do as Christians, is get more offensive-minded, get more engaged in that. So there are a bunch of points making the same verse. Now, having said that, because there is so much to battle, because there is so much to fight, because there are so many things happening now, we're seeing the culture crumble around us. This is where, Knox, we okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, give the end time when we finish church and when we finish church.
Okay.
Give us the full package.
All right, we'll do. So, running to the roar is the mindset that we have to get. Now, having said that, one of the things that's still going right now across the nation, I mentioned it earlier, because we speak in so many places, we're doing so many conferences, so much is happening on, that what's going on is, so we're at a point now because of what's happening in the culture and the way that we have seen 1,800 lawsuits in the last 15 years going after Christians who express their faith. What we're seeing with H.R. 5, an attempt to federalize really federalize attacks and authorize federal attacks on Christian faith. So it's become a big deal. So this is why people are saying we need a revival. And so folks across the nation are praying for revivals. I've been part of groups that have met in arenas with 80,000 people praying and fasting for change in America, praying and fasting for revival. So there's a lot going on there. I've never seen, we had 3 years ago, 50,000 groups met across America on the same day praying for revival. And they met in civic locations, not church locations. I thought that's huge. So it's good stuff. I think we're praying for revival, but here's the question I've got. How do we know when our prayers have been answered for revival? And the reason I say this, if you remember 6 years ago, we had a big drought in Texas. Remember the drought we had? It went for 7 years. We had that drought that went for a number of years. We prayed for rain. We prayed and fasted. The governor had us pray and fast for rain. And the rain came. We saw the rain came. We saw it. We knew when our prayers were answered. Now, here's my question I've got now. How do you know when your prayers for revival have been answered? How do you know when you can say, thank God, we had a revival. Let's thank God for it instead of praying for it. At what point do you know? And I'm going to suggest that most Americans will not know because we haven't studied the history to know what a revival looks like, because it ain't what we think it is. And so I want to take you through some of the historical stuff and even the biblical stuff. So what we have is, if you go in the Bible, there are a number of revivals that occur in the Bible. They occur in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and those revivals include folks like Asa, Jehoshaphat, and Josiah, revivals that changed the culture that they had back then. So with what's going with revivals, we can learn a lot from studying that. And I'll get into some of the characteristics. I'm going to show you 6 characteristics of revival that are both biblical and historical. So we also have our Great Awakenings in America. We had the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, Third Great Awakening, turn of the century revivals. So we have a number of revivals in America that are historically recorded. We can see the revivals that happened in Brazil, the revivals that happened in Guatemala, the revivals that happened in Scotland, the revivals that happened in England. You can historically study revivals and see what happens when a revival comes. So we have a lot of guidance that we can get from revivals, whether that be American history or Bible. There's a lot there. And so as we turn into that, as I mentioned, there's going to be 6 things. You okay, bro? So let me go back through these 6 things quickly. I'll try to move fast. There's 2 mindsets I want to hit first. There's 2 mindsets that we're dealing with right now as Americans particularly. Thanks, Knox. Appreciate it, bro. So these two things that need to be dealt with, and I want to deal with some attitudes right now, because we know this exists because we do a lot of polling work. And doing the polling work, I know what's out there. The Bible says you should be diligent to know the state of your flocks. And so again, we work with George Barton. George Barton does great work on knowing the state of the flocks. So 2 things. Number 1, mine says we have an obsession with the national focus. And what happens is, I don't care where you get your news. If you're left or right. If you're right, you probably go to Victory News, or maybe go to Newsmax or Fox or whatever. If you're left, you probably go to MSNBC, CNN, whatever. Wherever you get your news, it's all national focused. Everything is with a national focus. And what happens as a result, You've heard no stories about Aledo, Texas in national news. You've heard no stories about Scottsbluff, Nebraska, Watertown, New York. You don't know a thing about Yukon, Oklahoma. What we get is a heavy diet of national news. And so as we see that national news, what happens with that is we look at what's going on in Congress right now, we look at the Supreme Court, and we look at what's happening with the White House, and we all know that none of us can change that. I've got a lot of contacts with all those. I can call dozens of congressmen right now, and I cannot change a single vote that's been made in the last 4 months. You know, I know justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, so what? That doesn't change a single decision. I can't get into this White House, but I've been in lots of them. I can't make the president do anything different. So what happens is average people get paralyzed over what we see because we can't do a single thing with what's going on there. But that's what you get from the national news. From the national news, you get things that you really can't control, you really can't deal with, and even people much higher positions than I can't make differences and stuff like that. So what happens as a result, let me take you back to a historical example in the American War for Independence. The American War for Independence, if you recall what happened, the first 4 battles that occurred in the American War for Independence, you have up here the Battle of Lexington, 3 hours later the Battle of North Bridge at Concord, then a couple hours after that, the road to Boston, 19-mile forced march. Then right here you have the Battle of Bunker Hill. Let me take those in sequence. What happens is nobody called the national command and said, hey, Mr. Commander-in-Chief, we need your help right now. We got to have you here. We got a big battle to face. We need all national resources here. It didn't happen. There was no call like that went out. They all said, it's our community. We're going to deal with the battle here. The entire revolution, as you look at it, was largely local battles fought by local people who won local battles that combined to make a national victory. Now, George Washington did a few national things, the Battle of Brandywine and a few things like that, but most of the battles were all local people taking on what happened, and when that happens in enough communities across the nation, you have a national victory. So we tend to study looking at a national victory and a national commander-in-chief. That's not the case. I'll take you back to the first battle here, back up the Battle of Lexington. It happened on April the 19th, 1775, when 700 British came marching into Aledo, essentially. It was a tiny little town. It was a town, a couple hundred. Aledo's no longer a couple hundred, but when I was first here it was. So you have 700 guys coming into a little bitty town, and at that point, nobody contacts George Washington. What happened was the Reverend Jonas Clark said, my church will take care of this. So Reverend Jonas Clark took the 70 men that were in his church, and they went out and faced the British. That was the Battle of Lexington. Reverend Jonas Clark, the deacon of his church, Captain John Parker, is the guy who said, now guys, you've heard what pastors taught. You cannot start a battle, but if they start it, you can respond to it. God gives us the right to self-defense. He doesn't give us the right to create situations. He does give us the right to self-defense. And so that's why the British got the first shot in that battle. 700 shots fired before we returned fire. That's why 18 Americans hit the ground that day, because they get now that they have fired the first shot, God gives us the biblical right of self-defense. And so what happens is, in the second battle that occurs, 300 Americans are there to meet the British at North Bridge at Concord. But this time, the 300 men are led by the Reverend William Emerson, who got the guys together in town and said, hey, you're now shooting at us. We have the right to shoot back. So that's where we shot back. Some of the British hit the ground. The British said this is not going the right direction. We had 70 opponents. Now we have 300 opponents. There's only 700 of us. We're going to be outnumbered pretty soon. So they turned around and head back to Boston or Charleston. 19-mile forced march back to Charleston as quick as they can get there. And along the way, there were 4,500 Americans lining the road on both sides. It was like running the gauntlet to get back to Boston. Where'd all those people come from? Reverend Payson Phillips brought his church out. Reverend Benjamin Balls brought his church out. See, it was local communities defending the local communities. It was communities saying, this is our community. You're not going to do this in our community. Same thing happened at Battle of Bunker Hill outside of Boston. Reverend Joseph Willard gets 2 companies out of his church and says, guys, it's our town. Let's go fight for it. And so what happened was the American Revolution was all these kind of local battles. Now, we had a national commander-in-chief, and there are times when we needed national help, but generally what occurred was all local battles. So you get a national victory. It's achieved when you get enough local results, and that's the local focus that has to happen. Now, this local focus that happened in the American War for Independence is also what has to happen in revivals. Revivals occur locally. The way you have a national revival is you have enough communities that have revival that turns into a national revival. It's not a national movement that comes through and suddenly we all are on board with that. It's community after community after community after. So it's the wrong thing to do is to look nationally and say we need a revival. We need to look community-wide and say we need a revival right here, right where I am, right around me. We got to have a revival right here. And so that's the attitude that has always resulted in revivals, is people starting to get diligent about right where they live and what's around them. So the Great Awakening's much that way. When you look at the Great Awakenings, Whitefield is the guy we associate with the First Great Awakening historically. Whitefield had 34 years of preaching. He preached 18,000 sermons in America over those 34 years. Remarkable stuff that he did. And we're told that literally 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Here's the deal. What was technology like back then? Was he having arenas with 200,000 hearing a sermon? No. 80% of people heard him preach a sermon because that's how many communities he was in. He goes to this community, there's 30 people, and this community's got 500. He's in Philadelphia, it's got 8,000. He was all over America, 18,000 sermons community. There was revivals that were going on in community after community because they weren't connected. They didn't have the media. They didn't have the connection that put them together nationally. It's revival happening all over the nation in so many communities. And so that's what Whitefield, we call it a national revival, and it was, but it's a whole bunch of local revivals that happened. Samuel Cooper's the guy we don't hear about much. He was involved in the Great Awakening. As a matter of fact, he kind of staked out Boston. He's the big guy in Boston. Boston had revivals. Wasn't Whitefield necessarily. Whitefield certainly preached there, but there were people on the ground there doing things like Samuel Cooper. You had Gilbert Tennant. He was in the New Jersey rural areas and over outside of Philadelphia in the valley areas. He's the guy preaching there. He's the big guy that's doing revival work in that community. You have the same thing when you get to Samuel Davies in rural Virginia, out in the Shenandoah Mountains, out where there's not many people at all. That's where he was doing all the work. Revivals were happening out there in those communities. So we look at Whitefield, but there's really a whole lot of local folks involved in this thing all the way up and down. And that's what grows into a national revival, but it's got all this local stuff. So national revivals actually occur locally. We're not looking for a national revival. We're looking for a whole bunch of local revivals that change the nation. And that's the way the American Revolution was fought. That's the way the spiritual battles go. You have to do them locally. So the first problem we have nationally now, or first problem we have as Americans and as Christians, is we have a national focus because we have national networks. We have national news. We have national everything. And we know so much more about that than we do about what's going on in our own communities. The second difficulty we have is the idea that bigger is better. And the idea that bigger is better, we have that in so many areas. We get that, for example, we think about that with business. The fact that we have Walmart and big box stores, we get so much cheaper prices, we get whatever we want on demand, and they'll bring it to our car. And so bigger is better. It's not the mom and pop shops, it's the bigger is better. We have the same thing with education. We have a number of universities, have over 50,000 in the university. We have at least 2 universities, over 100,000 in the university. And we think that that's going to be greater ability to learn. When I'm one of 100,000, no, it's usually when you have individual contact, you get a lot more learning out of it. But nonetheless, we're in this mindset that look how big it is. It's got to be a great university. I need to go there. We have the same thing with the government. We apparently like bigger is better because we keep making government bigger, keep doing more and more things with the government. So we like bigger is better. We do the same thing with churches. It's interesting that when you look at churches on this bigger is better, going back to George Barton, there's 384,000 churches and senior pastors across America, calling 500 a day. What we find out is that there are 72% of churches that do not agree with the Bible and its teachings. 72% leaves you 107,000 who do. That's 28% of the churches in America agree with the Bible and its teachings, even things we were talking about earlier. So 107,000 churches. Barton starts calling, he calls these theologically conservative churches. 107,000 churches in America believe the Bible, believe what it says, believe you should live by it and do it. So he calls 500 of those a day saying, okay, as a theologically conservative church, how do you know if you're successful? How do you measure success? And so looking at the answers that theologically conservative or Bible-believing pastors give is very revealing. The top 5 answers, how do you measure success? By the number of people that attend, by the size of the offerings, by the square footage we have in use, by the number of programs we have, and by the number of staff members we have. Now, all measurements are how big is it? Bigger staff, bigger square footage, bigger programs, bigger offerings, and bigger attendance. That's how we know we're successful. So everything in success that we have in the American Christian church that is theologically conservative, biblically believing, we're using bigger is better as the measurement. Now, the problem is you always get what you measure. And whatever you measure, if you're going to do that, man, if I need more attendees, I'm going to make sure I don't say anything that ticks anybody off. So I will be completely bland. I won't confront the culture. I won't do anything because that'll chase people off. Oh, I need more offerings. Well, if I chase people off, I can't get more offerings. So what we do is we start creating a system that helps us reach our goals. But what if our goals are wrong? What if that isn't how you use the measurements? What if we've got the wrong measurements here? And we really do, because, again, this national mentality. So everything is about being bigger. Now, if you take the number of attendees and just look at that for a minute, megachurch, we have, I'll get to some stats here in a minute, but let's say a pastor, I don't know, just take out where we got the ranch in Jacksboro. Let's take a pastor in Jacksboro who's got 25 people in his church. Let's say he gets contacted by a church in Minneapolis that has 70,000. Say, Pastor, we've chosen you to now pastor this church in Minneapolis with 70,000. Which pastor is going to say no to that deal? Why? Because bigger is better. I can now reach 70,000 people. I can have greater influence. I can have greater impact. I can reach more people. So we measure our success in terms of how big things are, and that's why there are very few people in America who would turn down a small church in place of a big church. We think bigger is better. So what happens is we do that with revivals as well. Let's say that we take $15,000 out of the budget and we want to fund a revival in India. And we fund a revival in India and we want to reach the masses. But we find out later that only 7 people showed up to the revival. Wow, was that a waste of $15,000? No, you don't know that. How do you know that one of those 7 isn't the next prime minister of India that takes things in a completely different direction? Well, it was a waste of money. We put 15,000 in 7 people. See, we keep measuring things by numbers and by how big it is, and that's not how God measures things. That's not the right measurement. So we've got this view that a revival is going to create mass conversions and mass followings of Christ, and sometimes it does, but that's not always a sign of a revival. Jesus obviously had large crowds. We're told there times there were 5,000 men. Now, 5,000 men indicates probably about 25,000 in the crowd when you count women and children. And in a population the size of that one back then, that's a mega crowd. He had a lot of people following him. That's not what changed the world. It's the 12 guys he spent time with that changed the world. It wasn't those hundreds of thousands that may have followed him over those 3.5 years. It was a small group that he spent time discipling. That's what changed the world. So you have all of this that when you have a crowd, what happens is it shifts responsibility. For example, if you're in a church of 70,000, I don't need to do that. Somebody will do that, or will hire somebody to do that. If you're in a church of 12, I need to do that because nobody else is going to get it done. And so what happens is the bigger the crowd, the less likely you are to engage and actually do something. The smaller it is, the more you think about somebody needs to do something. Maybe that's going to be me. So that's part of what goes on. Now, with this, if I can take you through the demographics of the world real quick, when you look at world population, currently it's 7.9 billion. There are 4 major religions in the world. The way they break down demographically right now, 32% of the world professes to be Christian, 21% professes to be Muslim. By the way, 200 years ago, that was totally reversed. 200 years ago, Christians were way down the list. We weren't anywhere strong in the world. We are now. Muslims were dominant in the world 200 years ago. Third group is Hindus at 14% and Buddhists at 6%. Now, you take all of those groups, it's interesting that when you take that 7.9 billion and you look at what we do as Christians, we are very dedicated to reaching the world with the gospel, no question. We literally hire professionals on a full-time. We raise money to put out there pastors and missionaries and evangelists to go get the gospel to people who've never heard it before. That's part of what we do. That's our messenger budget. We are dedicated to getting the gospel of Jesus Christ across the world. Now, what we do as a result, in 2,000 years, we've made a lot of progress because we're now at 32%. However, let me suggest a different paradigm. Let's back up that 32% and just kind of look at that 32% for a minute. If we did the Great Commission of every one of you go teach someone else, because Jesus didn't say the church needs to go make disciples. He told every one of his followers that were there, you guys go make disciples of everyone. So the 70 that were there, the 120, however many was there as his ascension, he just said, last word to you, go make disciples of all people. So if we took that he wasn't speaking to professionals, because he wasn't. He was speaking to fishermen and tax collectors and political zealots and everybody else that was his follower. He's saying, you guys go make disciples. So if you get away from the professional mindset of having professional people do this and go back, if you take that 7.9 billion and 32% is currently Christian, I don't think all 32% are actually Christian. That's what they profess. We know a whole lot of people who profess Christianity who don't bear the fruits. But just for the sake of discussion, let's say all 32% are Christian. Let's say that every one of those 32% of Christians said, my only objective for this year is to find one person and disciple one person. That's all I'm going to do. I don't care how many are out there. I don't care how many else go by me. I'm going to find one person, and I'm not only going to get them to Christ, I'm going to disciple them afterwards. And see, this is a big problem with the church right now is we're into conversions, not discipleship. So if we can get you to say the sinner's prayer, that's great, victory. I will point out, I can teach a parrot to say the sinner's prayer. That does not mean they're a Christian. Jesus said, go make disciples. He didn't say make converts. He said make disciples, people who think right, who will follow me. So let's say that we make this decision that the only thing I'm going to do this year is reach one person and disciple one person, get them thinking right. At the end of 1 year, the whole world would be 64% Christian. At the end of 2 years, it would be 100% Christian. So what we've been trying to do for 2,000 years, we could do in 2 years if we looked locally, if we said just one person. So all I'm going to do this year is find one person. And let me challenge you to do that. Every one of us find one person and disciple one person this year. If you do that, that's where the exponential growth comes from. And that's what revivals were. That's why they were local back then. That's why it was communities. One person in the community would get another person, get another person, get another person, and pretty soon all the communities in the nation had this going. So the crowds shift the responsibility away. That's why, sending professionals out there, that's good. Let's keep doing it. But at the same time, let's take on ourselves the objective of finding one person, discipling one person. So acting individually and thinking locally, that's always key to having a revival. And that's biblically and historically, those things have to be there. Having said that, let me go through the 6 characteristics now. The first characteristic of the 6 is what we just talked about. It requires individual and local action. We talked about that. The second thing of the 6, it's about discipleship. It's not about conversions, it's about discipleship. It's interesting. You didn't have all that many altar calls go back to the First Great Awakening. Back at that point in time, the theology of America was what's called Reformed theology, if you want to say Calvinist. What's called Arminian, which is what Baptists and Methodists and Assembly of God, that theology had not yet come into America. That's the late 1840s when you get into the Arminian theology. So everybody is Calvinist essentially, which means, hey, if you're going to get saved, God's going to do it. That's not up to me. What I need to do is get you to think biblically. And so the First Great Awakening was not about getting people converted, because that's God's job. It's about discipling you and showing you how to handle economics and showing you how to handle sexuality and marriage and showing you how to handle your kids and showing you how to handle your business. It was all about discipleship, and that's what the emphasis was, and that's what great revivals are. They focus on being disciples. So Matthew 28:18-20, this is the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. See, what happened was, if you look at church history, starting in the 1920s to the 1960s, we took the Great Commission and we changed it into an evangelism mandate. Not that evangelism is bad, we know that it's not. Way back in Proverbs 10:28, the Bible says, he that winneth souls is wise. We know we should be evangelizing people, that's fine. But that's not what the Great Commission was about. The Great Commission was a discipleship mandate. He said, go make disciples, teach them everything I've taught you. Now, with discipleship, if we were to teach everything that he taught, let me just throw out some concepts that are what he taught that I don't hear many people talking about today. We teach people how to say the sinner's prayer, but let me go to some of these. Let's take, for example, Matthew 19, no-fault divorce. Jesus, in 15 verses, said no-fault divorce is a bad deal. Peter said, Jesus, Moses lets you have a divorce for any reason. And Jesus said, that's because of the hardness of your hearts. From the beginning, it was not so. At the beginning, he created Adam and Eve, male and female, and said, whatever God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And Peter said, this is a hard teaching. Yeah, even his disciples got offended. What's he talking about? He's talking about marriage and specifics and commitment and fidelity. That's not saying a sinner's prayer. No, he's teaching you how to think about all issues. So I have to say, America went to no-fault divorce in 1968. I've never in my life heard a sermon on no-fault divorce. Jesus preached one back then to his disciples. So if we were to teach everything he taught us, well, we have to deal with that. And yes, granted, right now, of divorces in America, the highest divorce rate in America is among born-again Christians. And right now in America, 87% of those who've been divorced became divorced after they became Christians. So apparently divorce is part of the Christian lifestyle today in America. See, this is where Jesus was addressing stuff back then that would still work today. And yes, it's going to offend Peter and a lot of other people, but Jesus still put it out there. So you'll have Luke 19 rewarding profit makers in that passage. Jesus talks about the parable of the minas. And the bottom line is, the guy who made the most, they gave him more. The guy who made the least, they took away what he had. And that's what we would call a capital gains tax. And now we were told last week in the joint session of Congress that those who make more, we have to take more away from them. That's exactly opposite of the way the kingdom works. Kingdom works exactly the opposite direction. If you're productive, we want you to be more productive. We're going to keep pouring it to you. If you're not productive, we're going to take that away because you're just wasting our time. And so you remember at that point when he told the parable, he said that after he took from the one who did nothing with it and gave it to the one who had 10, they said, "But Lord, he's already got 10. And Jesus said, "Yeah. To him who has will more be given. To him who has not will be taken away even that which he has." So Jesus, man, that's going counterculture for sure. See, this doesn't go with all the socialism, economic equality stuff that's out there. You have to actually earn your way and do something. Well, that's a teaching of Jesus. That's a great economic teaching. You also have passages like Matthew 20, opposition of minimum wage, especially verse 15, where Jesus says, "It's not my money, mine to do with as I please." No, the government's going to tell you you have a $15 minimum wage to pay everyone. And I was just approached by some people last night who said, "That's killing us. We're at the poverty level, and now because of minimum wage, we can't get a job anywhere because nobody wants to pay unskilled people like us to do stuff, so we can't even get a job anymore." Exactly. See, it's not my money, mine to do with as I please. And he also talks about the right of employee-employee contract there, that every worker he brought in the vineyard, he'd negotiate with them individually for what they were going to pay. One guy worked all day for a penny. One guy worked an hour for a penny. And he says, "Hey, this is the contract you made with me. Isn't that contract good?" And so the right to negotiate separate and different kind of contracts, that's a great teaching on business. And notice how many of Jesus' parables, he says, the kingdom of heaven is just like this. What does that mean? The kingdom of heaven is just like this. What? Business. And he went through all these. How many parables deal with economic practices? And he said the kingdom of heaven is just like when a business owner does this, or just like when a business owner pays this, or just, I mean, that's the kingdom of heaven. You also have John 8, the right of legal confrontation. We're told by legal authorities in the U.S. Federal Code that the right we have, the reason we have the due process clauses in the Bill of Rights, the 4th through 8th Amendments, is because of this teaching of Jesus combined with Proverbs 18:17. Those two verses, one of the substantial reasons you have what's called the right to legal confrontation. You have the right compulsory. You have the right compulsory to call witnesses in your behalf. That all comes out of this that Jesus taught. So if we were doing discipleship, we would be teaching practical things like that. The third thing that I'll point to, moving quickly, is it's very practical. We've already mentioned some of that. I put all of these issues up on the screen here because hopefully every one of you can put a Bible verse to every one of these issues. These have all been in the news in the last 24 months. If you can't put a Bible verse to these issues, you need to do some more Bible study because the Bible addresses specific. What's it say about the progressive income tax? Great question. A lot of Bible verses on that, actually, but we don't even recognize that. We think the Bible is something spiritual. No, the Bible is something very practical. It affects everything we do, every way. So all of these things, the right of self-defense, the right of anything, they're all there. So this is part of being able to disciple others. You can only teach them what you know. So we need to know this ourselves so that we can teach others what the Bible says on all of these issues. Now, if you look at what happened in the pulpit back in the day, Romans 12:2 says, "Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold." And the church today has been told what's spiritual and what's not. Oh, that's not spiritual. We only cover spiritual stuff. Look at all the stuff Jesus covered that isn't our spiritual stuff today. Jesus, if we were to talk about a lot of the things he talked about, most people would say, that's not church material. Right, but that's kingdom material. And that's a big deal. Jesus only mentioned the church 3 times in the gospel. He mentioned the kingdom 141 times in the gospel. So he's much more kingdom-oriented than he is church-oriented. We taught this out of the Bible because in 2 Timothy 3:16, 17, all scriptures given by inspiration of God is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. Bible teaches us what we need to know about everything out there. And so that's the mentality we have to disciple others, but we can't do that until we first find it ourselves. We need to see what the Bible says about all sorts of issues, and just look in the paper, and when something comes up, just start digging in the Bible. If you remember, Genesis 12 is where we get a good introduction to Abraham. He's introduced first in Genesis 11, then in Genesis 12, we're told that God says, whoever blesses you, I'm going to bless. Whoever curses you, I'm going to curse. So this is where Abraham really gets his footing. If you remember the story of Abraham as it goes along, Abraham has his 2 sons, Isaac and Jacob, And you take Jacob, and Jacob marries Rachel and Leah, and Rachel and Leah and Jacob, they have 12 children. And out of the 12 children, there's one that gets thrown into the pit, gets sold into slavery. Everybody assumes he's dead. He's not, but he's sold into slavery. And it's interesting that years later they get reconciled, because what was meant for evil turns out to be good. He's sold into slavery. He becomes the second ruler in the world, in that part of the world, saved him from famine. He gets reunited with his family. You know the story, how it goes. It's interesting that once the family gets reunited and they go back to Egypt, they get choice land in Egypt, the land of Goshen. And they've got that choice land, and it goes pretty good for them for a while, and then you have a Pharaoh who doesn't remember them anymore, and suddenly they start becoming slaves. And for the next 400 years, they are slaves in Egypt. And so after 400 years, God says, okay, I've had it. That's enough. My people are out of here. So he leads his people out. He sends a deliverer. Here comes Moses, and through the 10 plagues, they are miraculously saved. They go out even through what happens to the Red Sea, destroying the Egyptians. So God leads them out, and he finally, with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, he leads them and he gets them to that mountain. And they get to that mountain and he says, okay, we got to change some thinking here. He said, you've been slaves for 400 years. You think like slaves. On top of that, you think like Egyptian slaves. So you've really got some twisted thinking going on here. He said, now, I've got your full attention, because you don't have a clue where you're going. You're just following the cloud, but there's nobody chasing you. So we're here. I've got your full attention. You're not looking forward. You're not looking back. Let's talk about what it's going to be from here out. And at that point, God delivers to them 613 laws. That's what built the nation of Israel. These 613 laws cover every conceivable issue that we deal with today, because it took a bunch of slaves and turned them into the greatest empire in that era. They were the world's greatest nation at that point. How did he do that? By getting them to think differently. He gave them laws on business, on immigration, on foreign relations, anything you want to talk about, it's there. That's a complete package legal code. See, that's the kind of stuff we can take and apply today. Here's what God said about immigration. By the way, Leviticus 1934 is regularly quoted in Congress and is quoted wrong. If you go back and see what God said about immigration, our immigration policy is not right today based on Bible. Although, if you go back to the first 3 immigration laws we passed in America, 1791, 1794, and 1798, they were all based on the biblical view of immigration. Whole different view. See, we don't know the Scripture anymore, so our policy doesn't reflect what Scripture reflects. There's nothing out there, now technology, granted, I say nothing out there of substance and principle that God hasn't addressed. Technology, yes, that differs from generation to generation, but the underlying principles don't differ. So all of these issues we should be able to talk about with anyone. We should be able to disciple them. That's why, as I mentioned, the church is mentioned only 3 times in the New Testament. The kingdom is mentioned 141 times. Jesus wasn't building the church. He was building the kingdom. And that's what happens in a revival, is you build the kingdom of God. And so then the third thing is practical. The fourth thing is change occurs slowly. If you look at those revivals, what happens in those revivals, the first revival, the first Great Awakening, how long did it last? It lasted from 1730 to 1770. That's 40 years. Do you realize how slowly things change over 40 years? If you're 40 years old, just think back to what's happened to you in the last 40 years. There's a lot of stuff you don't even remember. You know? So it changes slowly. The Second Great Awakening goes from 1801 to 1878. Some historians divide that in the Second and Third Great Awakenings, but nonetheless, you're talking 77 years. You could have been born in 1802, died in 1877, been 75 years old, and never knew that your whole life was lived in revival. You wouldn't recognize it. See, a lot of revivals are unrecognized until after they're over. The turn of the century revivals go from 1880 to 1910, about 30 years. The Azusa Street revival kicks off. Then here comes Billy Sunday that extends that even out further. So you have these things that span decades. They last decades. That's the Great Awakenings. And it's interesting that not only do they span decades, most people never knew they were in a revival. George Whitefield did not know he was in a revival. It was historians who wrote about it after the fact. They looked back later and said, let's call that the First Great Awakening. It wasn't called that when they were in it. Second Great Awakening wasn't called that when they were in it. They didn't even recognize it. It was historians who looked back later and said, there was something different going on. Let's call that a revival. And so what you need to understand is if you're expecting God to sweep in on Sunday night and the nation be well by Monday morning, it ain't going to happen. It takes decades, because it takes a while to change people's thinking. It takes a while to change thinking across the generations, because you have to get a generational view of this as well. So that's the fourth thing, is it's a process, not an event. If you're looking for a quick change in the nation as a result of revival, it never happens. It will happen, but it happens slowly. Change Curse law. By the way, let me throw out something right now. We know that the nation is very hostile to religious expression. H.R. 5, that federal bill that's trying to federalize hostility against religious expression. We have Supreme Court Chief Justices, and the way you consider a court is called the John Roberts Court, or it's called the Rehnquist Court, William Rehnquist Court, whatever. Did you know that under William Rehnquist, who was on the court for he was Chief Justice for about 20 years, from about 1985 to about 2005, in the Rehnquist Court, and he's a really good guy, he fought for religious liberties. Only 58% of religious liberty cases that came to the Supreme Court in the Rehnquist years did we win. So even though the First Amendment guarantees us religious freedom, we were only winning 58% of what the First Amendment guarantees. Under the Roberts Court right now, did you know we're winning 81% of cases since 2005? Now that's a huge, huge shift. We have more religious liberties that we can practice publicly today in America than we've had in 60 years. You have to go back prior to 1962, the last time we had. Does anybody feel like it's more religious liberty today? No, but what do statistics show? We've had a huge increase in wins on religious liberties. Now, future generations are going to look back and say, hey, that was a revival. Look how good they did on religious liberty. It went up by 50% in that time. That's how revivals happen. We don't feel like it's here, but future generations look back and say, there's something going on back then. Look at how the courts changed. Look at how the decisions changed. There was a lot of hostility, but look how they won these cases. And so that's where revivals come from. That's why historians are key to revivals. The fifth thing is it becomes transgenerational. If I can take you back into Judges 13, in Judges 13, they were praying for oppression, praying for God to deliver them from the oppression of the Philistines. The Philistines were all over them. They couldn't have their culture. They couldn't do what God wanted them to do, and they prayed. And according to the Scripture, it indicates that they prayed for many years. And finally, God hears and answers that prayer. You can say it's a prayer for revival. We want the nation to be different. We want the enemy to be gone. We want things different. So verse 5, God sends an angel to deliver the prayer. It says, I've heard the prayers of this people. You've been praying a long time. Here's how it's going to work. And so an angel comes to earth. He goes to a guy named Manoah and says, Manoah, God has heard the prayers of this people, and we're going to have a revival. Here's how it works. Your wife is going to get pregnant. And when that kid grows up, he's going to be the national deliverer. He'll deliver you from the Philistines. Wait a minute. You said my prayers were answered. I got to wait 20 years for this kid to grow up before I get national deliverance? Another 20 years? Yeah, because God often answers our prayers for revival by sending a different generation. Let me give you an example right now. In America right now, this year we became 51% pro-life nation. It's taken us decades to get there, but we are now a pro-life nation. We're at 51% for the first time. Most of America, this is great. Millennials right now are at 72% pro-life. Now here's my question. How did they get 20 points more pro-life than everybody who teaches them? Because Jesus said in Luke 6:40, every student when he's fully trained will be like his teacher. How did we get a generation that's 20 points more pro-life than their parents, than their teachers, than their pastors, than everybody else? It doesn't make any sense unless God sent a new generation. You think abortion's going to last when these guys get in office? No, it's not. See, only 19% of them have supported abortion on demand. All the stuff we've been fighting for now 50 years, 40 some odd years, 48 years, are going to go away pretty quick when that generation gets there. We're now seeing some of these guys get elected to office. We saw 3 guys get elected last year that were, or year before, last election, that were elected to state legislatures, and they were 24, 25, and 27. And they said the reason I ran was to get rid of abortion. Now, see, they're starting to get in office now. They're starting, that's their issue. That's what they want to see done. So you have that. So millennials and Gen Z, this is a transgenerational kind of thing that's happening. Revivals always are. Go back to the Great Awakening. You remember I mentioned the Reverend Samuel Davies, he's out in the rural parts of Virginia. Who's in the rural part of Virginia? What size crowds do you get out there in the Shenandoah Mountains? Well, one kid you got was a kid named Patrick Henry, who grew up under him. See, Davies took time with this little kid. He didn't know what Patrick Henry was going to be, just a kid at church. And he took time with that kid. Samuel Davies is considered the greatest orator in American pulpit history. Nobody is better public speaking than Samuel Davies. Who's the best public speaking founding father we had? Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry said he learned it from this guy right here. See, that's transgenerational. One generation trained the next generation, and look at a difference that came with that younger generation when they got in there and changed the whole nation. You have the same thing when you go to Gilbert Tennant. Gilbert Tennant in the rural areas of Pennsylvania, around Philadelphia, over in New Jersey. There was a kid at his feet all the time, just kind of almost tripping over him at times. You know, this kid's always with him. It's a little kid named Benjamin Rush, one of the three most notable signers of the Declaration. John Adams said the three most notable founding fathers are George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush. Started the first abolition society in America, led the national abolition movement, started the Sunday school movement, started the first Bible society. He's great political guy. He ratified the Constitution, signed the Declaration, served in 3 presidential administrations, the greatest physician in American history, the first chemistry teacher. The guy's unbelievable what he did, and he learned at the feet of that guy right there. Nobody knows him. We know him. We don't know him. He's the guy who trained him. You have the same thing that goes on when you had Samuel Cooper up in Boston. There was a little kid who ran around. Samuel Cooper even took this kid on vacation with him. This little kid named John Quincy Adams. I think he had an impact on the nation. See, this is discipleship. You disciple the next generation. It's not how many masses you get. It's who can you change, how can you change their thinking, and what will happen when they get in there. And a great example, and that's the millennials and Gen Zs of that day. Let me take John Quincy Adams for a minute. Just run you through his political career real fast. When he was 8 years old, he had his musket out with the Massachusetts Minutemen. So he's already part of the militia system back at the age of 8. When he was 10 years old, he got an appointment as the secretary to the ambassador to France at the age of 10. When he was 14 years old, Congress sent him to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia, and he was in Russia as the actual official congressional representative. He spoke 6 languages, so he was the official translator there in Russia. So he's 14 years old, speaks 6 languages. Then on top of that, when he was 16 years old, Congress sent him to set up the peace negotiations to end the American Revolution, the Treaty of Versailles that happened in Paris. He's the guy who was sent there to arrange it. He was the secretary for all the peace negotiations. So that's 16 years old. Yeah, and then when the nation gets started, he becomes a diplomat under George Washington at the age of 21. George Washington said 21-year-old John Quincy Adams is by far the best public official we have, the best foreign relations guy, the best diplomat. He continued to be a diplomat under his father, John Adams. Under Thomas Jefferson, he became a U.S. Senator. Under the 4th president, James Madison, he went back to being a diplomat. He actually negotiated the end of the War of 1812. He was appointed and confirmed the U.S. Supreme Court, but turned it down because he was ending the war at the time. And the 5th president for James Monroe, he became the Secretary of State, and then he becomes the 6th president of the United States. When he becomes president of the United States, he served 4 years after that. He goes into Congress. He's the only man in American history that went from being a president to being a congressman. And he enters Congress, and as he enters Congress, his deal is slavery. He hates slavery. He wants it ended. He wants abolition. He's called the hellhound of abolition. He got his teeth in that issue, would not let it go. The problem was when he had his teeth in that issue, he said 80% of Congress at the time was pro-slavery. So he's a definite minority. He's definitely fighting an uphill battle. And so in all the years that he was in Congress, interestingly enough, he's a super famous guy. I can't express to you how famous and how well known he was across the world. And so every freshman that comes in wants to buddy up to the old man. As you can tell, he's not a people person. That's not his personality. I mean, his thing is, I'm going to end slavery. It's not, I'm going to spend time with people. And so it's interesting that a freshman came in, he didn't really seem to get attached to him except one. There was one freshman that came in that he seemed to get attached to, and he kind of mentored this kid. And this kid really picked up from John Quincy Adams, learned that John Quincy Adams came up with a 3-step plan to end slavery back in 1843. Congress didn't pass it, but we could have ended slavery 20 years before the Civil War. He learned that John Quincy Adams has all these plans to abolish slavery in D.C. So the bills that John Quincy Adams introduced, this kid would pick up and push. He'd carry these bills in Congress. Well, it turned out that they only had 14 months together. 14 months after that kid came to Congress, John Quincy Adams died on the floor of Congress. So when he dies on the floor of Congress, this kid is appointed to the Congressional Committee on Funeral Arrangements for John Quincy Adams. Amazing that he got, as a freshman, to help arrange the funeral stuff for John Quincy Adams. So they put the train on the body to take John Quincy Adams from D.C. back to Quincy, Mass. And when they do, this kid sees hundreds of thousands of people lining the railroads just to get a glimpse of the body of John Quincy. And he's just struck by how much impact John Quincy Adams had. And he wants that impact. And so he keeps running for office, and it just never works out. It never worked out again until 13 years later when he became the President of the United States, because the kid he mentored was a guy named Abraham Lincoln. Now, that's kind of substantial. So Abraham Lincoln gets in office. He says, hey, I know this three-step plan that will end slavery. He's now in office. He's got a three-step plan. He says, and he's the guy who presides the end of slavery. Now, John Quincy Adams would have really loved to see the end of slavery. It's what he gave his life for. Didn't get to, but he trained the guy who ended slavery. So that's kind of substantial. See, that's the way revivals work. They're transgenerational. So you take the Second Great Awakening, which is where John Quincy Adams, he lived in the middle of the Second Great Awakening, and he trains this young kid, and this young kid gets mentored in a way that he goes on and impacts the nation. So that's the fifth thing. The sixth thing I'll cover real quickly is it requires a lot of hard work. And this is where I think it shocks most people to see what went on. When you take George Whitefield, what he did, Whitefield, without his preaching, there is no United States. That's said by a number of founding fathers. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Franklin talked about particularly his father Abraham's sermon, how that's the reason that America really came to be. Without Whitefield, there's no United States. That's just pretty universally agreed on. So Whitefield, it's interesting that he had opposition all the way from the start. Here's a guy trying to get the nation in the right footing, and he gets opposition, and it's interesting where his opposition came from. Most of the opposition came from the religious community. I cannot find a secular piece of writing anywhere that attacks Whitefield. I can find lots of religious pieces that attack Whitefield. Whitefield got his brains beat in by people like Reverend Charles Chauncey, who's a huge name preacher back then. Matter of fact, we have records that preachers, and by the way, why did Whitefield preach outdoors? Because no church would let him come inside. Now, that's why he was out there. Eventually, he had large crowds and needed outdoors, but that's not the way it started. The way it started was, you're not coming to my church. You're not going to share that stuff here. So he would preach outside and preach, and the pastors would literally tell their people, go get up in the trees over him and pee on him and defecate on him and throw rocks at him and throw potatoes at him and hit him with cabbage and tomatoes and vegetables. And this was pastors telling their parishioners to do this. Now, we look back and say how glorious it must have been to be in the First Great Awakening. Ask Whitefield how much fun it was to be in the First Great Awakening. It wasn't all that much fun at all. And that's characteristic of revivals. So the church is often the last one to get on board, and usually when they get on board, it's three-fourths of the way through the revival, and then they take credit for the revival. I mean, they're the ones who fought it most of the time, and then they end up taking credit for it, which is the great irony. So he preached 18,000 sermons, 34 years of preaching. Does that sound like a lot of fun? No. Consider what he was doing. He got on horseback and traveled from Georgia to Maine and back 7 times on horseback. Now, you can't control weather. You can't control lodging or anything else. You're just on horseback. He had a portable pulpit he kept with him. He would fold that pulpit up, put it on the back of his horse, ride to the next town, sit up in pasture, have a service. And this goes for all those 34 years. Not just a whole lot of fun in that at all. As a matter of fact, if you want to know kind of what it's like, take Francis Asbury. He's the great name in the Second Great Awakening. Francis Asbury did the same thing. He preached on horseback. He put 300,000 miles on horseback. That is going around the world 12 times on horseback. That's a lot of hard work. I mean, just think about saddling that horse, unsaddling it, feeding the horse, taking care of the horse, grooming the horse. This horse is worn out. I got to find a new horse. There's a lot of work in this stuff. We look at the glamour of having a great awakening and what it did to change the nation. We don't look at all the work that went into it. So the work is there. It's got to be there. 80% of all Americans heard him preach again because he was in that many communities, riding up and down, back and forth. He could have made it from Georgia up to Maine in 2 months. It'd take him 2 years because he hits every community as he goes through. So it's a lot of hard work. So his preaching literally killed him. He's buried at a church where he preached in Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1770. In the last 2 years of his life, after he would preach, he would go off to the side and spit up his guts and throw up a lot of blood and just cough and hack and then get back on his horse, ride to the next place and preach, and then he'd go off the side and spit up his guts and spit up a bunch of blood and cough. Not fun. Without Whitefield, we don't have anything in America like we know today. So if we think that having a revival is an inspirational time, study the life of Josiah. Study the life of Asa or Jehoshaphat. See all the battles they had, all the conflict they had. Changed the nation, but it wasn't easy along the way. So that, with Whitefield, it wasn't inspiration, it's hard work. So just closing it down for this morning requires hard work. So the question actually becomes, we're praying for revival. How bad do we want one? Do we want one bad enough to say, okay, I'm going to be involved in individual and local actions. Not the nation I'm worried about. It's my community I'm worried about. It's my neighbors I'm worried about. It's nobody else. It's those around me. Are we willing to disciple others? Take one person and say, I'm going to spend my life pouring into you for the next year. I'm just going to help you think right. You can't go up and say, hey, you're thinking stupid. I'm going to help you think right. Dumb approach. Don't do that. But create a relationship. Actually, it's interesting that right now millennials and Gen Zers, millennials are about 38, maybe 39, 40 down. Gen Zers are about 21, 22 down. It's interesting that those two groups right now have terrible views on most issues. While they're good on life, they're wrong on marriage, they're wrong on sexuality, they're wrong on business, they're wrong on government, they're wrong on most everything. And yet, what we know in polling is they're the ones who most are desirous to be mentored. See, only 14% of Gen Zers go to church right now, but they are wide open to people talking to them about Christ and church. They just don't want to come here to do it. And I wouldn't either. I mean, the church as it exists in America is pretty worthless right now. See, it's interesting. Here's another piece for you. In the last 20 years, the number of professing Christians in America has dropped from 85% down to 65%. In that same period of time, megachurches have exploded. If you just look at the megachurch graph, man, America is Christian. If you look at stats, it's going the other way. And when you ask these 20%, why don't you go to church anymore? 2 out of 3 say because there's nothing relevant at church. I get nothing relevant at church. And again, they're begging for discipleship. So we studied the polling of Gen Zers, we studied of millennials, and they are begging to be mentored. Actually, with millennials, they're the only group in polling history that if you ask them, who do you want to, at work, who do you want to spend time with? Everybody else, I want to spend time with my friends, my coworkers. Millennials say, I want to spend time with the boss. I want to be mentored. They're looking for that kind of relationship. So are we willing to disciple others becomes the second part. The third is practical applications of the Bible. Do we know the Bible enough to apply it to economics, to all these other things, and help them be able to apply it? That's the solutions they're looking for. Fourth, it's a process, not an event. It does not happen over the weekend and suddenly Monday morning we're all going to be healed as a nation. It just doesn't work that way. 5 is it's transgenerational. So are we willing to engage? I don't care if you're 18 years old, find a 15-year-old and mentor a 15-year-old. Whoever you are, or could be some 15-year-olds need to mentor some 55-year-olds too. 15-year-olds may think better than 55-year-olds. So it's a lot of hard work. Those are the things that go with the revival. But that's what I want to share this morning. It's all about running to the Word, being offensive-minded, getting engaged in these kind of things. Turn off the national focus, turn off the national mentality, get engaged in the people around you and changing their lives. Make a commitment to find one person over the next year and just pour yourself into them. Disciple them, make a difference with them, mentor them. That's what will turn the nation around. Knox, back to you, bro.